Welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone today to our 5th webinar in the series brought to you by the Social Planning Network of Ontario and our community of practice on equity and inclusion for low-income students. As many of you are aware, the Knowledge Network for Student Wellbeing is no longer in existence, but our work is important, and so we continue to do it through the Social Planning Network of Ontario and in partnership with organizations like the Faculty of Education at York University. My name is Yvonne Kelly. I'm the co-lead of the Community of Practice. The webcast today is the 5th in the series of our interviews with leaders in research and individuals with experience on topics that impact low-income students and parents in our schools. We hope that you enjoy our broadcast today. We know you will enjoy our broadcast today and that you will register for upcoming webinars that will be shared with you in the coming weeks and months. First of all, I will give you some little housekeeping details. We have an opportunity to post questions throughout the webcast, and you'll see where you can do that in the question box. We'll answer them either throughout the webcast, depending on the questions, or at the very end, the last half hour. If you do lose your Wi-Fi connection for any reason, you can call into the webcast, and the phone details are provided in the information that was sent. Articles that Paul and Vidya will reference and have shared with us will be in the handout section. And we will forward you more information after the webcast about the second and third events in the series with Paul that's co-sponsored by York University. That will come out to you as well as a short evaluation. So today we're honored to have 2 guest presenters. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them already, Dr. Paul Gorski and Dr. Vidya Shah. So I'm going to do a bit of an introduction. Dr. Vidya Shah is an educator committed to issues of equity and justice. She is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at York University and teaches in the Masters of Leadership and Community Engagement, a graduate program in Language, Culture, and Teaching, and initial teacher education programs. She received her doctorate in educational administration from the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education at U of T, and her research explores the contributing factors to school district reform for equity. Vidya has worked in the Model Schools for Intercity program in the Toronto District School Board and was a primary, junior, and intermediate classroom teacher in the TDSB. She also writes curriculum focused on social justice issues and is actively involved in community initiatives. Welcome, Vidya.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. Happy to be here.
Great. Now, Mr. Gorski, founder and lead equity specialist. Paul is a founder of the Equity Literacy Institute and EdChange. He has 20 years of experience helping educators strengthen their equity efforts in classrooms, schools, and districts. He has worked with educators in 48 states and a dozen countries. Paul has published more than 70 articles and has written, co-written, or co-edited 12 books on various aspects of educational equity, including Reaching and Teaching Students in Poverty, Strategies for Erasing the Opportunity Gap, one that most of you will be aware of, and Case Studies on Diversity and Social Justice Education with Seema Pathini. He is the author of the Multicultural Pavilion, an online compendium of free resources for educators. And how often do you see those? Paul earned a PhD in educational evaluation at the University of Virginia. He was a teacher, educator at several universities for 15 years. He is also a published poet, a black belt in Taekwondo, and the biggest fan of Buster his cat, who may just join us during this webcast. We're never sure. So we are going to share a little bit of information about other events that are coming up, and then I'm going to pass things over to Paul and Vidya. This is a conversation today, so you're going to learn a lot just by listening to them discuss all the work that they're working on in this area. And as we're going to be debunking deficit ideology, grit, resilience, those kinds of things. But right now I want to draw your attention to a future events that are going to be happening that are co-sponsored by the Faculty of Education at York University, including Dr. Paul Gorski and the Social Planning Network of Ontario. For anyone who registered for this event, unless you registered, the last 100 people may not have received this updated information. On November 9th and 10th at York University, Paul will be here for a weekend workshop, November 9th and 10th. I keep wanting to promote the May one first. And then on May 2nd and 3rd, 2:20, he will provide a Train the Trainer event, which will also take place at York. And there's all kinds of details about where people can stay as well, right on campus. So if you've had access to this information, make sure to register because spaces are limited. And for those that didn't have access prior to now, I will be sharing that out with you following the broadcast today. So now I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful guests. And Vidya is going to share with you some information about other projects and initiatives that she's been involved in through Reskin. And so right now, we're going to do that. And Vidya, you're up.
And so just before I share that, I do want to just take a moment and really thank Yvonne for her unbelievable contribution to equity in education. It has been, she's been a champion of this work for such a long time, and we have all learned so much from her and gained so much from her commitment. So I just want to start off by saying that. And Paul, yeah, and Paul, so excited to be in conversation with you. I told you this when we met in person, that I feel like you need to be an honorary Ontarian, given the amount of work that you do in Ontario and the thousands and thousands of educators and students that your work has impacted. So super excited to be here with you.
Awesome.
Mutual.
All right.
I'm
So
going to
here we
disappear for a minute. Here we go.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Yeah.
So am I sharing screen? Yes.
Yes, you are.
So I just wanted to take a quick moment. Yvonne mentioned that she's part of the Network for Wellbeing, and I'm part of the network for the Equity Knowledge Network, so the Réseau de Savoir sur l'Équité Equity Knowledge Network. And it's a network that focuses on how we can think about mobilizing equity knowledge on the ground, taking research and policy and turning it into better and better practice. And so what I'm showing you here are some of the blogs that have been written about very sort of current and relevant issues. And we encourage you to go to the site and take a look to see what some of those conversations are. Orange Shirt Day, microaggressions, a number of other topics that are very current and relevant that we want to be thinking about in education. The other thing I wanted to share just before we start our broadcast for today is a documentary that was put out by the GTA team, and it's called This Is Not a Resilient Story. And it really challenges notions of what student voice can and should be, and it problematizes traditional notions of how we think about student voice. And so this is definitely a documentary that you're going to want to check out. Hashtag TINARS, TINARS. This was a production between Noor El Husseini, who was a very, very talented educator, activist, creative person, G. Mark Weston, and it's exciting to think about how we might problematize this notion of voice and who has voice and what voice and the role of pain, and questioning notions of the myth of neutrality when we think about student voice. And so there's a number of community folks and educators featured in this documentary sharing very, very important perspectives. So we hope you do check that out. We will be sharing at the end of this a list of resources with all of these links on them so that you have access to them. But you can also follow at YorkU Education. You can follow at Poetic Practice, myself at Vidya Shah 6 on Twitter, and we share these resources quite regularly. Finally, we wanted to share the Reskin Equity podcast series, and we're super stoked about this. This is in partnership with Voice Ed Radio, and in particular Stephen Hurley at Voice Ed Radio. And you'll see here that there are these are essential conversations about equity and human rights in education. And there are 7 episodes: Inclusive Design, featuring Camille Logan and Jiwan Chanaka; Dismantling Islamophobia, featuring Rizwana Kadardina, Nora Hindi, and Saima Chowdhury; Dismantling Anti-Black Racism, Fiona Lloyd-Henry, Natasha Henry, and Tana Turner; Leadership for Social Justice, Donna Cardoza, Tina Lopez, Debbie Donsky, and Nouman Ashraf; Indigenous Sovereignty and Right to Self-Determination and Education, Diane Longboat, Pamela Agawa, Tanya Senk; Streaming and Educational Pathways, featuring Alison Games San Vicente, Jillian Parek, Diana Grimaldos, and Annie Kidder; and finally, Youth Leadership with Riven Thorne, Curtis Carmichael, Charlotte Clark, and Aliénor Rougeau. So just a couple of things that we're doing here to promote conversations around equity and to challenge notions of resiliency and grit, as we will get into today.
Thanks, Vidya. Now, Paul, we're going to hand it over to you to share whatever you'd like to share. That's not it.
Well, that's okay. I don't actually have anything to project onto the screen at this point. I just want to say, Vidya, it's great to be here. And I second what you said about Yvonne Kelly as well. I don't have anything big and exciting to share right now. I just hope everybody will check out the Equity Literacy Institute website. And I'm just excited to jump into the conversation.
That's great. Take it away, guys.
So today's conversation is titled Quitting Grit, Ditching Deficit Ideology, and Embracing an Equity and Justice Approach to Poverty and Education. And so we're going to be speaking today about the challenges with popular approaches to closing achievement and opportunity gaps, some of the common missteps that schools take in their equity efforts, and some key understandings to help guide an intersectional approach to equity and justice in classrooms, schools, and beyond. So one of the things I've been thinking about, I think that's really important, a really important place for us to start, Paul, is what are some of the problematic ways that schooling processes further marginalized students and families that are already marginalized by low incomes? I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, one thing I'm really interested in, and I would love to hear your observations about the same thing. You know, I think obviously we all know that there are systemic and structural conditions that create a situation where access and opportunity are not distributed fairly across race, across socioeconomic status, across all kinds of different things. And so often when we talk about equity, we point to those sorts of things. And I think some of those are, you know, pretty obvious, and we could get into those. But also what I'm interested in is, you know, the community of us who are really passionate about equity and justice, or about diversity and inclusion, or whatever language anybody is using around this sort of thing. And the ideas that seem compelling to us, like not us each individual, but as a community of people that we sort of grab onto, even though if I take a step back and look at it, it's probably creating more inequity. And I think the first one that I railed against, who, you know, someone who's really popular in Canada and in the US, is Ruby Payne. And, you know, I can remember the first time somebody recommended I look at a framework for understanding poverty. And true story, I thought it was satire. I just could not understand. It was just so full of deficit views, but there are a lot of people in the diversity and inclusion community who really grabbed onto that and thought it explained all of the problems, despite the fact that it's based on this whole idea, the culture of poverty or the mindset of poverty, that had been completely dismantled in the 1960s. In the early 1960s to the late 1960s, the literature that came out, we knew there's no such thing as a culture of poverty or mindset of poverty. So to me, the biggest problem is not that necessarily that there are a lack of people who care about these issues, although we need more people who care about them, or that there aren't enough schools doing enough things, because I think schools are doing things. I think the problem is most schools are doing things that are based on misunderstandings of why the disparities exist, why the gaps exist, what the inequities are. So we're left with the mindset of poverty, or we're left with grit, or we're left with growth mindset, instead of racial justice or economic justice or gender related justice. So to me, the biggest problem is really a lack of understanding, a lack of consciousness, a lack of will, and this tendency to take whatever the shiny new thing is and just fling it at the problem. So, oh, there's an outcome gap. Let's just throw growth mindset at that, or trauma-informed practices, or emotion regulation, or we'll just keep throwing stuff, and none of it works because none of that's got anything to do with why the gaps exist. To me, that's the biggest problem.
You know, I see I think we see that here a lot too. And I mean, it's true for all just districts, but there's very good intentions and very good, lots of, as you're saying, money thrown and effort and energy. And the question is, and I think you raised this too, Paul, but are we solving the wrong problem? What problem have we identified? And if that problem is located in families and students and communities, we're going to be solving problems that don't actually exist. And how do we redirect that problem-solving initiative to systems, and how systems perpetuate and maintain these inequities? And I think one of the biggest ways that I see it happening here in Ontario is this ideology that excellence and equity are two separate things, and that they're actually conflicting and actually undo the other. And so thinking about, how are we thinking about students? How are we thinking about learning? How are we thinking about pedagogy when we see those two things as separate? And how are we thinking about students learning and pedagogy when those two things are the same thing? I don't know how we can have excellence in teaching and learning without equity. And I don't know how we can have equity without a focus on many forms of excellence. And so that's one of the things I've noticed here quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, the way that often comes out in the US is an obsession over test scores, right? So in a way, the whole conversation about equity has kind of devolved into this group needs higher test scores and that group needs higher test scores. And the result of that is really seeing the problem as existing within marginalized communities and how do we fix them so they get higher test scores. The part that has sort of been erased is the focus on deep pedagogy, on strong teaching, pedagogically engaging teaching. And of course, the part about equity has been completely wiped out. Like, what are the policies and the practices in society, or the policies and practices in schools that give this group of students an advantage over this group of students? As long as that advantage and disadvantage exists, that's where the disparities are. And in a way, it's hard not to see that as purposeful, that kind of shift in conversation, because there we have to start talking about a bigger redistribution of access, redistribution of resources, rethinking of the ways that we organize schools that are not done in ways that, in essence, are designed to privilege the families that are already the most privileged. So there's sort of been this distraction of, test scores. We got to raise the test scores. We got to raise the test scores. And the truth is, even if all we're going to obsess over is the test scores, we still can't do that just by fixing, quote unquote, adjusting the mindsets or the belief systems of people experiencing poverty or racialized people or whoever it is.
I think one of the biggest tensions in this work is the importance of collecting identity-based data, which is something that Ontario is really now starting to take up in much bigger ways. So largely it's been the Toronto District School Board and that has been collecting identity-based data and sort of disaggregating it on the basis of disaggregating achievement and engagement and well-being data on the basis of race, social class, gender, et cetera. And more school boards are starting to take this up. And I think that it's such an important political tool, to be an ideological tool, to be able to push conversations forward. And at the same time can be extremely dangerous because all we're focusing on is the gap, and the gap and a particular gap. We aren't measuring what our school systems, what are their policies? Do they have the right policies in place? We aren't measuring what processes are in place if community members or students or families feel that their voice isn't being heard. We aren't measuring systems. And I will definitely get into this later, but I want to sort of put a bug in everyone's ear to think about how can we measure differently? Because what we measure is what we end up focusing on. What can we measure? What else can we be measuring? How can we change the success criteria for what we are measuring in schools and in school boards to challenge this notion that the problem is with individual students, families, and communities?
Yeah, so, and I always think about, people commonly use the term opportunity gap. I think one part of the opportunity gap is something that I call the experience gap, because a gay, racialized person and be doing really well academically and still be experiencing all these traumas because of the racism and the heterosexism and that sort of thing that I'm experiencing in the school. The just measuring test scores and graduation rates, that doesn't get at, I think those things are important in their own way, but they don't get at, am I experiencing, you can't measure the impact of curricular erasure, like I'm invisible in this curriculum. You can't measure the impact of, I feel like a visitor every time I walk into this school. You can't measure the impact of that just by looking at test scores and graduation rates. And probably one of the best ways to improve academic outcomes and graduation rates is to address those issues. So I think that's part of the expansion that needs to happen.
Absolutely. Engagement and well-being, I feel, are really important, and continuously problematizing what we mean by that. And I think one of the things that I so appreciate about your work and others, Paul, is this idea that there's no end point to this work. There's no we have arrived. There's no way of thinking about this work as this is what it looks like. We are in constant conversation and constant rethinking about what equity actually means. And by nature, we have to be. And so I'm really excited about that. I'm wondering, Paul, if you can share with us, we talk a lot about, and we hear this as well, when we think about students who are marginalized by poverty, that is often an area that is under-focused, I believe. And at the same time, I've noticed this trend that when we start talking about poverty, it's often void of conversations about race. And we know that there's a color to poverty. And I'm wondering if you can share any thoughts or experiences that you've had to sort of challenge this notion that when we're talking about race, that we're ignoring the poor white students. How do we challenge notions that this idea that oppression is separate, and this idea that we can coexist as separate beings who are facing forms of oppression, not in connection to other forms of oppression?
Well, I don't think to me, it is completely nonsensical to have a conversation about race that doesn't include conversations about how structural or systemic racism is wrapped up in class issues. And I also don't think it makes any sense to have a conversation about class and poverty issues without talking about how disproportionate levels of poverty in racialized communities is racism, is structural racism. So I just don't feel like we can pull these apart. Now, I do think when it comes to talking about race specifically, I do think, especially for a lot of white people, you need to start sometimes isolating race because it's too much, it's too tempting. I just see it too often with white people talking about race. If I give them the opportunity to change the conversation to class, it's like, oh, it's all about class. It's not about race. So I think there's like a point that you reach in the arc of learning about these issues. We say, okay, we need the intersection, but there's also a part where white people really need to practice talking about race without constantly reverting to class, class, class. It's all about class. It's all about class. And I think once we practice that a little bit, then, in order to evolve our understandings of class and race and disability and everything else, that's, that we have to look at them intersectionally.
Yeah, I was thinking of that. I've noticed a lot of moves to gender as well. So we're talking about race, gets a little heated, and then it either diverts into class or it diverts into gender, one or the other. But it's noticing that and being aware, as you say, that there's an arc and there's a limit of against which we might come up against. And, not just white folks necessarily, but whiteness operates that way. I've seen a lot of folks in bodies that look like mine that also make these moves into gender and class. And so how can we, be conscious of that as well, I think is super important. Well, maybe let's share a little bit about the equity literacy framework for folks who haven't had a chance to see those principles. I think they're super important. And then you and I can sort of get into a conversation about what they are and how they show up here.
Well, I'll just give a sort of an overview of the framework, equity literacy. It's a framework that I've been developing along with my colleague, Katie Swalwell, who's a former social studies educator. But the idea of equity literacy, one of the things that we noticed was in a lot of conversations about diversity and inclusion and those sorts of things, that it was really easy to kind of detour away from equity as a central part of the conversation and talk instead about maybe celebrating diversity, or talk about cultural diversity, or talk about cultural competence, or talk about just that we noticed in schools that people were saying they were talking about equity, but really what they were doing is, let's learn a little bit about this culture and a little bit about that culture, or let's have a multicultural arts and crafts fair, or things that really don't create more equity by themselves. So we wanted to develop a model where the primary idea was to keep equity and justice in the center of the conversation. So in the model, really, the first question is, how does racism operate in your school right now? How is it operating right now? To me, that's the central question. In a lot of frameworks, you kind of work up to that question. But we really think that's the question to start with, and everything else goes to that. How does sexism operate? How does transphobia or ableism or whatever it is, Islamophobia, whatever it is, how is it operating right now in your school or school system, and how to address that? So because we think that's a central question, equity literacy is, in a way, a set of tools or guidelines or principles that help us focus really strongly on addressing that. How does racism operate? How do you eliminate racism from the system? And again, there's nothing wrong with cultural competence, although there's a lot of troubling ways that people put that into practice. There's nothing wrong with celebrating diversity. It's just that you can have International Food Fair every night, and that is not going to make your school less racist or less whatever. So equity literacy is about the knowledge, the skills, and the will to identify and eliminate inequity and injustice. So I think of it as based around a question: what are the knowledge and skills that I need to be a threat to the existence of inequity and injustice and oppression and all of those things? What are the knowledge and skills I need to be a threat to the existence of inequity within my sphere of influence? And so we sort of base the model. I think my screen is shared. If you all can't see this PDF, if you go under the little handouts tab in the control panel, you can see this handout and download it. It's just called Equity Literacy Principles. So I'm not going to talk about all of these. I'll just talk about a few of them. And would you rather me just go one by one and we talk about them, or would you rather me just talk about a few of them and then we can talk about them together?
Maybe the few that stand out for you that you think are important at this point, Paul. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start with the first one. It's called the direct confrontation principle. So that's sort of the baseline principle for equity literacy. The idea there is that the only way we can get to equity is directly confronting inequity. That doesn't mean, sometimes that means directly confronting people, but really what we're talking about there is identify how all the ways, even the subtle little ways, racism, transphobia, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, identify even the subtle ways that those exist. And the only way to create more equity is to identify those things and drive them out of the learning environment, and then learn how to develop policies and practices that are equitable to begin with. So that means we can't detour around equity by doing things like, oh, well, we had a community dialogue. Oh, well, we had the International Food Fair. There's nothing wrong with those things, but there's nothing about those things that will eliminate racist policies or eliminate economically unjust practices, right? So identify the policies and practices that are doing the damage directly and eliminate those directly.
Well, if I could just jump in there for one moment, this one speaks to us so much, and many scholars have spoken to this, many educators have spoken to this, that education was set up to sift and sort. That was its purpose historically, and I think one of the ways that we need to be most mindful of the slippery ways that it continues to happen is, what are the ways that we continue to use education as a vehicle to create winners and losers, haves and have-nots, two-tiered systems? How do we continue to do that in our practices every single day, and policies and structures?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I always like to say, when we identify a policy or a practice that's doing damage across race or class or whatever it is, it's really, in some ways, the first step is change that policy or practice. But we also, that's actually not even enough. We also have to reflect on, what is it about institutional culture or institutional misunderstanding? What is it about the ways that we do things that resulted in us having racist policies or practices to begin with? And that's where we get at some of the underlying thing, like you just mentioned. Like, how did we end up with this totally sexist dress code policy? It's not enough just to change it, because if we had the sexism enough to inform a sexist dress code policy, that same sexism is informing a lot of other things we're doing in the school. So if we don't get at the root of it, and then the bigger structural historical root, like you just mentioned, then we're bound just to keep reapplying it in different ways, even as we might address little instances of it. So should I talk about another principle?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to skip to number 3 here. It's called the equity ideology principle. The equity ideology principle is that equity is not just a list of practical strategies. And I find sometimes in education, people really struggle. Education tends to be very practical. So if there's a problem, what is the popular solution? And we just start throwing solutions at the problem. And that gets us into all kinds of trouble. So really, what I've learned is that shifts in practice are informed by shifts in ideology. And if there's no shift in ideology, then there is no sustainable shift in practice. So, we would never think it's a good idea to give, white supremacist, teachers with a white supremacist ideology 5 strategies for teaching racialized students effectively. But in essence, we do that. We actually sort of do that.
Yeah.
Or, it's not enough to say, well, these teachers have a deficit view of students experiencing poverty. Well, let's just give them 5 instructional strategies. I always say there are no instructional strategies that will help educators with a deficit view of students experiencing poverty be an effective teacher for those students. We have to shift the ideology. So that's the ideology principle. Let's see. The prioritization principle is one that a lot of schools I work with struggle with. The idea is that it's not enough, equality is not enough. Equity is really about prioritizing the interests of the peoples whose interests historically have never been prioritized. So how do we, for instance, prioritize the interests of families experiencing poverty or racialized families? How do we actually prioritize their interests in all the ways that historically white students' interests have been prioritized and for the same length of time for which we've been prioritizing the interests of white students. If you just do the math, that's really probably what it's going to take to create equity. So for instance, what if we completely rethought how we do family engagement, just completely rethought it and start over and think about how do we do family engagement in a way that prioritizes access to the most economically marginalized families, or to the most racially marginalized families, or to families who perhaps don't speak English at home or speak languages other than English at home. That's the prioritization principle. And then finally, I'll mention the fix and justice, not kids principle, which goes back to what we said earlier, which is that that none of our equity efforts should be about modifying the mindsets of people who are marginalized, should not be about changing the cultures of people who are marginalized, should not be about changing the behaviors of people who are marginalized. It should be about addressing the conditions that are marginalizing students. So if any of our efforts are going to identifying the source of the problem within communities that are marginalized, we're actually doing the inverse of equity instead of equity. So those are, I think, four of, to me, the most important principles of equity literacy.
You know, I'll pick up on the prioritization principle. I've been thinking a lot about, as a South Asian educator, and how does this operate in me? So I am not white, clearly, but how does it operate in me? And it's this notion of oppression Olympics that often happens. And when we think about, as a South Asian educator, I walk into a school, I see young South Asian females, and I can tell that many of them don't feel like this is a place that they feel reflected or seen. They might feel invisible. You can just kind of pick up on that. I know I've had those experiences in schooling as well. And at the same time, I'm conscious of the fact that there are students whose identities I don't share who are even more marginalized in systems. And how do we, I think that it's such an important point that when we think about prioritization, we think about who is doing the prioritization. What are the identities of the people that are prioritizing, and how does that impact what gets prioritized? And in the absence of identity-based data collection, we tend to prioritize folks or children or students or youth with our experiences because we recognize there's a common recognition in what that experience might be. So even though South Asian females might be a demographic that needs to be tapped into because of a number of different issues and feelings of invisibility and not feeling like they're represented in the school and social emotional well-being, and that might not be where we need to start. They might benefit as a result of other things that are put into place for students that are even more marginalized by the system. But how do we, I think this is, we really need to be reflective as educators on where are we prioritizing, because there are many areas of need, there are many types of oppression, and we see them often as disconnected. And our own stuff comes into that. So I think one of the ways that I've taken up the prioritization principle is to be thoughtful in myself about who am I prioritizing and why, even though there's a number of different groups of students that require prioritization.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. My experience working with schools is it's the majority, not always the numerical majority, but even when schools do collect data, if they're not looking at it by different identity groups, the problem is the experiences of minoritized identity groups can get sort of washed out in the data. So what if we have, 5% South Asian students, but we're just looking at means across the entire thing, is that their experience can get washed out by that. That's why it's so important to look at those data. And I also want to say one other thing about the data. I think sometimes qualitative data the importance of it gets underplayed. All this quantitative stuff can give us sort of a broad view of what's happening, can give us an idea of what's happening on average. But I think what's also really important are the stories of, that's what gives us the depth. So the stories of people who are being marginalized, I think we also have to see that as critical data that we're also responding to. In fact, when people ask me, well, how do I know? People will say, I don't hear anybody telling me they're experiencing racism or whatever. So how do I know? And I always say, well, ask the students, ask the racialized students of color, and then more importantly than asking them is believe what they say. Believe what they say and be willing to adjust what they say. And of course, even if I do go and ask, if the students don't trust me before I ask them, I don't know if I'm going to get good data. So there's that, below that is a lot of relationship building and trust building that's got to go on before even the asking happens.
Thank you so much for naming that, Paul. I think it's one of the big dangers around identity-based data, that students become numbers. They become, just another problem to fix, is what can happen with particular forms of quantitative data or only quantitative data. And so getting at that complexity, I think, is so important. Complexity of identity, complexity of experience through qualitative means are so important. One of the other, the hashtag fix injustice not kids, I just love that. I just love that hashtag. And it makes me think about, all of the ways, and I've really appreciated this about your work, that you name the ways in which oppression gets rebranded and repurposed and repackaged over time in different ways, called different things, but it's the same idea. It's the same idea about fixing kids. And so here, in Ontario, and I'm sure you have it there, a lot of the focus on trauma, on mental health, on self-regulations or zones of regulation, on character development, on grit and resiliency. All of those are ways that can be very problematic because it focuses the attention on the students and not on systems. One of the I had the fortune of being an external on Kisha McPherson, Dr. Kisha McPherson's PhD paper or PhD presentation, and she was problematizing this notion of hashtag Black Girl Magic. And what she was saying is that while there is so much, while that hashtag speaks to the level of resiliency in Black girlhood, it also completely absolves systems of their responsibility, and it normalizes the state for Black girlhood of needing to be this resilient all the time in order to survive in the system. And it's not challenging racism and sexism, classism, and the intersections of all that. And it's just so present for me how much this stuff gets reiterated and rebranded over and over and over again. And we need to really develop the lens to see this. And this is what your equity ideology principle is all about, the lens to see the ways in which very affirming and empowering movements like hashtag Black Girl Magic can be co-opted in really problematic ways.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to me when I, something like that, one of the fears I have is what white people will do when they get their hands on that. Because I think there is this kind of white liberal love for, oh, look, this resilient story, love the result. Look at this person worked so hard and overcame all of this. And the question that never happens is, well, what the hell is going on that is requiring children to have to survive all of this stuff in order to access, something they should, and what else could they have energy to do if they weren't having to put their energy into navigating racism? Or, do I tell my teacher that what my teacher just said is racist, or do I let it go? I do, one of the things I do when I'm working with different districts often is I do focus groups as part of my own data collection, collecting the stories. One thing I always notice, like I'll do a focus group of students of color, or it might even be, very specific, like African American students, something like that. And whenever I ask them something like, well, how often are you experiencing racism or racial bias or that sort of thing? They often say, the response is always the same, every day, multiple times a day. I ask LGBTQ students, how often are you experiencing bias, heterosexism, whatever, homophobic jokes, every day, multiple times a day. And that's alarming by itself. But what's even more alarming is when I ask them their responses to it. Do you feel comfortable reporting this, or how does the school handle it? Most of the time what I hear is, in essence, well, I've just figured out that I have to learn how to handle that. Like, I have to learn how to cope with that. That's just my experience in school. It's just, I got to learn how to cope with that. I think that's the systemic racism that guarantees that I have to deal with all of this other stuff before, I address. Now, I mean, I think I don't have a problem with a big general conversation about how all of us can figure out how to be more resilient, but I have a big problem with that conversation being most dominant in contexts where there are the most, the people who are the most marginalized people. And I have a big problem with someone like me, a white teacher, ignoring racism and saying, well, you just need to be more resilient. And I think that's the out that those things give us, in the absence of racial justice.
And thank you so much for that distinction, Paul, because so first of all, there's what we don't measure is the trauma that schools and schooling cause for racialized and other marginalized students. That's often not a measure that we consider when we're talking about trauma. And thank you also for the distinction that resiliency isn't a bad thing. It's bad when it's used in ways to focus on individuals and not on systems. And I think that is such a clear distinction. A brilliant educator that I know, Andrea Menezes, she's a kindergarten teacher, and she talks to her students about how they can locate power within them. And so much of the importance of so much of the resiliency narrative is how other people see us and how we have to respond. But even shifting that lens in terms of how do we see ourselves, it's such an important part of the resiliency conversation, and it gets co-opted in different ways for different students. One of the things that happens most often here is the whole mindfulness movement, and you've talked a lot about this, Paul, and I know that mindfulness and meditation are practices that are near and dear to both of us. And so I've just been really thinking about, how problematic it is that these are practices that originated in Eastern spirituality and Eastern ways of knowing, and then they get co-opted and appropriated in Western culture, and largely to make students more efficient or to reduce stress or to be able to focus, which is not the purpose of meditation. It's actually spiritual liberation. We never talk about that. And then it gets weaponized against particular groups of students who are deemed, too loud or too rude or too, agitated or whatever it might be. And often those groups of students that it's weaponized against are groups for whom would identify with those original worldviews. It's just so amazing to me how something that is so deep and so powerful and has such important origins gets capitalized, co-opted, appropriated, and then the call out of it doesn't even make reference to the original purpose of it being a form of spiritual liberation. It's amazing. It's just amazing.
Yeah, all of that. It also gets commodified. In other words, an industry pops up around it, right?
I love it, meditation.
And who benefits from the industry that props up around it, right? To me, the biggest shame about this I also think restorative practices is sort of similar in the sense that it's often weaponized against students of color, students experiencing poverty. But the other thing I think about is how powerful meditation could be as part of an educational experience if it was used with integrity, or how powerful restorative practices could be if they weren't used in ways that are often feel like they're in conflict with commitments to equity and justice and trauma-informed practices, social emotional learning. I think all of these things, I think, I don't, in a way, I hate saying it like this, but the truth of the matter is I think a lot of sort of white liberal people love these things because it sort of creates the illusion that we're doing progressive education, but it also sort of works around contending with racial injustice or anything else. But, you know, like trauma-informed practice, I was a kid who experienced trauma as a kid. I experienced the trauma of sexual abuse and other sorts of things. And one of my experiences in school was feeling like I was constantly being punished for behaviors that were reasonable behaviors in light of the fact that that's what I was experiencing. So I want us to have a complex conversation about trauma-informed practices and how do we address that. But I see where the value of that could be done and how powerful it could be done if it's done through an equity and justice lens. The problem is, to me, it seems like it's always done instead of an equity and justice lens. Same with social emotional learning instead of an equity and justice lens. And I think a good starting point for schools who are doing trauma-informed practice is that if you're not starting with the reality that for some students, school is the most traumatic thing in their lives. So what are the ways that students and families and even marginalized identity educators are being traumatized by the school system? If we don't start there, if we ignore that and then just try to be in some surface way responsive to, you know, our presumption that just because someone is experiencing poverty that they must be experiencing a lot of trauma at home. You know, for a lot of people experiencing poverty, school is way more traumatic than anything they experience at home. So if we're not starting there, then we're doing trauma-informed practices wrong. We're doing it in a way that butts up against our commitment to equity and justice. But if we're doing it right, then it can be powerful. Restorative practices can be powerful if we do them through a racial justice, economic justice, other kind of justice lens. But if they're done in a way where, well, this kid was just targeted with heterosexist or homophobic joke, and now we're going to make that student sit down with a student who was just bullying that student so they can restore whatever. That's not justice, you know. And it's not the student being bullied. It's not their responsibility to reestablish whatever. It's the school's responsibility, you know, to protect that student from the homophobia. Now, most people who are really grounded in restorative practices would say, well, that is a misapplication of restorative practice. And it is a misapplication, but it's also a very common application. And so I think that's what we have to grapple with.
I think that's such an important point. And I think about, you know, when we think about other ways of knowing and being, and when we think about this work, the importance of centering Indigenous knowledge systems that have been actively engaging in restorative type practices and trauma-informed type practices for generations. And when we really think about taking an equity lens or approach to this, it's A, recognizing the historical aspects of this, but B, it's also, you know, thinking about how can we go to families and to communities and to organizations that have been and thinking and working through this for so long, and center them as experts in this discussion about what do we need, how do we do this differently, and how do we do it in different ways so that different students can access it from different points. I think is such an important part of this conversation as well. You know, it also it's the one size fits all model for all trauma that is also very problematic, or all, you know, restoration, or all whatever it might be. And there are so many ways that this can be taken up when done in ways that honor who the students and the families and communities really are in our schools.
Can I interject for just a minute? Hi, guys.
Easy, Vaughn.
Would you be willing to answer a couple of questions, because there's one or two that are so prevalent to what you were just talking about, especially where it comes to prioritization principle. So I'll pose that question. I've got two, and then we'll continue on and save the rest of the questions for the end. So we had a lot of great questions. One person asked, would you agree to consider the idea that when it comes to the prioritization principle in the context of Turtle Island, the priorities of Indigenous people learning supersede all others because of the silencing of Aboriginal curricular content and perspectives through multiculturalism? So that's specific to the prioritization principle. You talked about that a little bit already. If you can expand in terms of Indigenous peoples.
Great question. Paul, do you want to start?
You go ahead.
So, what's that? I missed that. Paul, say it again.
Oh, I said you can go ahead. You look like you wanted to respond there.
So I think yes. I think that we are on stolen land, and we need to recognize that, and we need to understand that we are not just focusing on issues now, but we are looking at this from a historical lens and redressing historical issues. I also think that there's a misnomer that focusing on what is necessary for some is going to, discount other people or not focus on other issues. And I think that's a huge misnomer. I think that focusing on what is necessary for some is beneficial to all. And I think another thing that we need to consider is that when we think about oppression as being interconnected, and we think about liberation as being interconnected, and we think about identity as being interconnected, when we think about it in that way, while we are prioritizing one, it inevitably is benefiting everybody. We can't see them as separate. It's when we see the world as we are all separate individuals and we're not deeply interconnected, then we get into this issue of, if I focus on this, I can't focus on this. Having said that, we so easily, and we need to make this very clear distinction that Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty and anti-colonial education is different and separate from, although related to anti-racist education, and needs to be foundational to all of the work that we're doing. So I would say yes.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly, way better than I could have said it. I do want to sort of just echo the idea that the misnomer that you mentioned. I mean, certainly different groups who have been colonized, marginalized, oppressed, have different, the lived realities of that are very different, and even within groups, the lived realities of it are, of course, different. The systems and structures that underlie all of that are related to one another. And to me, that's why if you address the oppression of any group, prioritize the interests of the people who have been the most historically marginalized, where there's the most historically marginalized, it actually addresses things in systems and structures that are also marginalizing to other people. So that's what I've seen in my work in school systems.
Thank you, Paul. Yvonne, did you want to?
One more. I'm going to throw one more out at you guys because I know you both, and it's not about talk, it's about walk. So here's a good question. We've seen schools and educators get stuck in a circle of training as a way to improve and move towards equity and social justice education. How do we move beyond just knowledge mobilization and training to systemic action?
Great question. Paul, do you
might want to answer that throughout the rest of the questions because I think it's there for everyone.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that, I've had this experience. I had a colleague when I used to live in Minnesota, and I had a colleague who did very similar work to me. And what we noticed was that often I would get invited into a school or a district to do like professional learning, to go through kind of a sequence, and right up to the point where we'd say, okay, now that we're doing this, it's time to actually start talking about the action. How are we going to put this into practice? And as soon as we would reach that point, they would stop inviting me and they would start inviting my colleague and start over at the beginning. So there's just this cycle of like diversity 101, never getting, and I think part of that is it creates the optics or the illusion that we're doing something but it still protects what's happening now. I really think, to me, that's a failure of leadership, and it's often a strategy used by leadership. And that's partially why I completely adjusted what I do. So now when I go into a school or a district, I always say I want to start with two groups. I'm going to start with leadership, and I want to start with a group of people who are already working on these issues at the school. And instead of going through this slow awareness process, we're going to move at the pace of the people who are the most ready to move. And we're going to start with the question, for instance, how is racism operating right now in this school? So we're going to identify that, and then we're going to start working on solutions. And that's the beginning of the process instead of the end of the process. So the whole process is built around those shifts. So that's a way that I've been able to do it. I still find that people have a lot of reluctances and ways of throwing up roadblocks, but I think a big part of the problem in schools and school systems that I've worked with is that generally when it comes to these issues, there's a tendency to move at the pace of the people who are least interested in the progress. And I think that gets us into what the person asking this question, I think that's what gets us into that cycle. And if we moved at the pace of the people most ready for the progress, we would put pressure on everyone else to keep up and move along. And to me, that's what works.
Yeah, I love that, Paul. I've been thinking a lot lately about how part of that responsibility falls on people being asked to do the workshop or the session. So I'm so glad that you're raising that. And I've been thinking a lot lately about reframing when I'm asked to present in a school or when I'm asked to present wherever, reframing the question into what is already being done. And if there isn't a commitment to this already being done and this isn't going to push the agenda forward, actually saying no, because it is more damaging to allow a school or a district or a group of people to check off that, yes, we've done our Equity 101 training and not do anything after that. And I'm complicit in that if I'm contributing to this whole notion. And, I think the other challenge with this is that there are so many experts in school districts and in schools that never have time or space to share what their expertise is. And outside experts are often called in. And I think about this especially with regards to racialized folks, racialized women in particular, other marginalized folks that have expertise in these areas. And because of the bodies that they're in, they may share the exact same thing as an outside expert in a white body, and they are up against barriers in their in their professional growth. It's quite a dangerous thing to experience. And so this idea that expertise is often located outside of us, and then that when expertise is, and then there's the unpaid, unmentioned labor of so many internal experts doing work that never gets mentioned, that gets taken up by the entire system and used as sort of system protocols. And it invisibilizes all of this labor. And then there's the backlash. There's this person seen as a threat. This person is seen as dangerous. This person is seen as going against the culture of the organization. And so there's so many challenges with this notion of expertise being outside of systems. And so I think that for folks doing this work and sort of coming in as outsiders, what we have to continue to make visible and what we have to continue to push for is this idea that in what ways are you honoring the expertise that's already in your system? In what ways are you making room for those voices, as dissenting as they are, and especially the dissenting voices, because that's where in that diversity of thinking you can actually move things forward. I think that's a conversation that we need to be having more as folks committed to this work.
Totally agree. And I often say to school leaders and system leaders that if you say you're committed to equity, then the people who are speaking the loudest about that in your buildings, they should be the center of your institutional culture. This is hard for some people to hear, but I think the reality is the people who are being resistant to the people speaking up, the people who are trying to shush the people speaking up, the people who are wagging their fingers at the people who are speaking up. If you're doing equity right, those people should feel marginalized in your system. They should really feel like, I don't know if I belong here anymore. But usually it's the most outspoken people, the most people who are the most desperately advocating for racial justice, who are feeling, especially if they are racially minoritized people, that they're often the ones feeling like, I don't know if I can survive this institution anymore. And to me, that's a leadership failure. If the people least invested in equity and justice in your building feel more part of the central institutional culture than the people who are speaking out about these issues, that is your failure as a leader. And I just say that to them straight up, and I think it hits some people hard, but that's the reality. You have to stop moving at the pace of the most resistant people. I'll also, the piece about, a lot of the facilitation, I do co-facilitation. It's very obvious, especially when I'm when I'm co-facilitating with one of my colleagues of color, very obvious that people are hearing stuff from me completely differently than they're hearing it from someone else, even if we're saying the same thing. And sometimes we even have to strategize, like, so my colleague of color might say, well, I will lose credibility with this group if I say this, but you'll gain credibility with the group if you say the exact same thing, right? And again, I think that within the context of institutions is really a failure of leadership to create the context for the work to happen.
I think that's such an important point, Paul. And I really, one of the reasons I agreed to this webinar with you is because you get that. Like you really get that, we're in two very different bodies and talking in fairly similar ways, and how that gets taken up differently. And I think that for a lot of racialized folks and a lot of racialized women, there's a lot of mistrust and a lot of needing to really build relationship, and one of the most important ways to do that is for folks in bodies like yours to name this out loud and to name the ways that it operates and to name how damaging it is for us, because it's so insidious and it happens so frequently. And I was watching as this webinar was being shared on Twitter, and I was just watching how people were tweeting. That's a whole discourse analysis project in and of itself, but how people were tweeting this out. And it's almost like this is a conversation with Paul Gorski, so Paul Gorski's talking to himself. I'm hoping you're not talking to yourself. I'm hoping you're talking to me. But just how quickly and how easily this can get erased, So I still appreciate you for your willingness to name this and your willingness to stand up for it and call out ineffective leadership that continues to perpetuate this. Paul, I'm wondering, are there any, and then maybe what we'll do, I'm looking at the time as well, but are there any last thoughts on what schools or school districts that are committed to equity, what that looks like for them? Like, what are when you go into a school or you go into a district, how do you know that a school or a district is really committed to equity and it's not just a checklist item? What do you look for?
Well, I think the first thing is I look for leadership and how leadership is talking about and weaving this into every conversation or not weaving it into every conversation. I think that's really important. Like you said there, I think there are a lot of people, and I think disproportionately people who have experienced being marginalized themselves, who are doing amazing things in schools that they often have to close their classroom door to do because they don't have the support from leadership or administration. So looking at that, I look at whether any kind of deficit ideology, if I hear that, because that's so prevalent in schools, just in side conversations between educators and these parents, they don't care, and these kids, and why don't they value education and all of that. I think in a school that is making progress, leadership does not, equity can't live where deficit ideology lives. So if I see that leadership or just the culture of the school, and not just leadership, but people are addressing that with each other, I see that as progress. I see open and honest conversations, and that the people who are the loudest about the issues are rewarded instead of being punished for that. I see that. And then that filters down into everything. It filters into the curriculum, it filters into pedagogy, it filters into, eliminating tracking, so we're not organizing students in very predictable ways, shifts in policies and practices. Places where I see moving the fastest, there isn't this need to, like, we have to have 10 years of community dialogue before we can change this dress code policy. There's got to be somebody saying this dress code policy is sexist, we're changing the dress code policy. And then engaging people who have experienced the marginalization in that conversation, not to put all the labor on them, but recognizing where the institutional expertise is, changing changing the policy. And again, moving at the pace of the people who are most ready to move, instead of thinking that we need a consensus, because we're never going to have a consensus. So if you have 20% of people who are really on board for racial justice, economic justice, we should be moving at their pace, and then having the expectation that everyone else keeps up. And then maybe, I'll work with people individually to bridge them along. But, so that's also what I see. At whose pace are we moving forward?
I love that. And I love those. I think it's so important for us to start redefining criteria for what schools and school districts that are committed to equity, what that looks like. And I think the more that we can redefine that criteria and include contradictory criteria, so that we're continuously problematizing and troubling what we are thinking of as equity, is so important. I think one thing I'll add, and this comes from a recent paper that I wrote called Calling in the Self. The one thing I'll add is that as folks committed to equity and justice, it is as important that we are thinking about our complicity in this work and how we continue to perpetuate and maintain this work because of our own individualist stuff that's going on. And this is where, blurring the binary between self and system, I think, is so important, or self and other is so important, because when we are operating with our own unrecognized trauma and fear and insecurities and all these things that are operating, we think we are focusing on systems. We think we are focusing on system change. And what we're really doing is reproducing our own stuff over and over and over again. And this article was sort of born out of the idea that it's in equity-minded spaces that I've experienced some of the greatest violence and oppression. And I think that that's an important thing for us to be thinking about and naming, because so much gets hidden, so much gets not talked about, so much gets sort of like wiped aside because there's a greater commitment that we need to attend to. But what if that's part of the process? Like, what if we can't? It's not just about changing the bodies that are doing the work, it's about changing the ways that we do the work. And so I think about the importance for equity justice leaders in particular to be continuously questioning the ways in which we are perpetuating violence and oppression that we are seeking to dismantle out there in some nebulous world.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And I'll just say, particularly for white people in particular, I think it's really important for white people and white men to reflect on what we're bringing into, if we're going to enter into those activist spaces, what we're carrying with us into those activist spaces. And some of the work I've done lately around activist burnout, I did this interview study where I interviewed 30 racial justice activists in the US. And the pattern that I saw when I asked them, well, what is the biggest source of your burnout? These were all people who had experienced burnout. And for a majority of the activists of color I interviewed, they said their biggest source of burnout was not white people or whiteness, but having to deal with white activists and what white activists are bringing into activist spaces. and trying to fluff up, so that's why I always say I think one of the biggest barriers is really white liberalism. I know we all bring stuff, but I think, as someone with a lot of privileged identities, pushing people who have privileged identities to think about how we're carrying those into supposedly, changed contexts.
I love that. Thanks so much, Paul. That's such an important point.
So you guys
Yvonne,
ready for some questions? Are you ready?
Sure.
You've worked really hard, and people are being very supportive and thanking you on the questions and comments that you can't see. So I'm going to select, we've had a lot of questions. I'm going to select a few that seem to represent a broad spectrum of questions that we've received. One is a little bit more specific though, and I'm going to read it directly. Recently, it was announced that OSAP, which is our Ontario Student Assistance Program, student loans, will be given to students who are able to return the loan. So this is in the province of Ontario. Is this equitable for students who are poor?
Yvonne, can you just read that one more time? Because it's so specific.
Okay, so can you hear me okay though?
Yeah.
Yeah, so recently it was announced in Ontario that the Ontario Student Loan Program the Ontario Student Assistance will be given to students who are able to pay that back to return the loan. How is this equitable for students who are suffering with, dealing with low income?
Yeah, it's not.
There you go.
I have to say that it's not. It's not an equity-minded stance or principle at all. You're punishing folks that are already marginalized by low income, and further removing access and opportunity. So I think it's a ridiculous policy, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you want to really say how you feel about that? Excellent. Paul, do you have anything to add to that, or?
I don't know enough about the policy there to,
right.
But
that's okay. We'll move on because we've got lots of great questions. Could Dr. Shah and Dr. Gorski talk a little bit about the potential role of digitalization in schools in both maintaining and dismantling the problematic discourses surrounding equity?
Great
I
question.
can read it again while you think about it because it's lengthy. So it's about the potential role of digitalization in schools in both maintaining and dismantling problematic discourses surrounding equity.
is that referring to more use of computers and internet technologies and that sort of thing?
I believe so. Yeah.
Well, I think it's like anything that is done in schools. I think if it's done through an equity and justice lens, it could have an equity and justice impact. But if it's done through the regular course of how we do everything else in education, it's going to have the same impact as everything else in education. So an example that I often use related to that is I know for a lot of schools, it's very popular to adopt some sort of online platform to communicate with parents and to share home and to do homework and all of that. And people think of it because it's technology progress, they think of it as progress. But of course, the problem with that is you might actually be creating less access for the families who already have the least access and more access for the families who already have the most access. So that's a good example of how, and to me, and this is where equity literacy comes in, because if I have that equity literacy lens, I'm looking at that a proposal for something like that, and I'm saying, well, how is this going to impact our families who are the most economically marginalized out of all of our families, and I'm going to prioritize their interests in the decision. But if I don't have an equity lens, I'm going to say, oh yeah, that's going to be really efficient and convenient for this, for most of our kids or for us. And so we're going to put it into practice. So.
Okay. I'll just add one to that, Yvonne, is that, I think for me, the biggest challenge with technology, with STEM, with math education, with a number of different, subject areas is this idea that they can exist as neutral spaces. I think this is what I really appreciated, Paul, what you said, that everything needs to be looked at through an equity lens. And with the assumption, there's often the assumption that, language and literacy or history and social studies, that's where you can talk about the issues of equity and the issues of power, but it's operating in every subject area all the time. And so we need to be really conscious of the ways that digitization is being used to further exclude and further marginalize and bring people into the conversation. And I also think about, I've been listening a lot or thinking a lot about, online applications, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., and the ways in which we are creating, the ways in which the algorithms are set up to create echo chambers. And so that it convinces us that we're talking, that many more people agree with what we're saying, or that many more people are part of the conversation that are not. And we're actually, in what ways is that fueling, can that fuel hate and disconnect? And how might we think about, our ability to talk, to speak across difference, to listen across difference, to engage in conversations that we might not be engaging in because the echo chamber of the 30 people in my group are all kind of saying the same thing. And so how do we get to a place where we are really supporting and being reflective and thoughtful, recognizing that what we say online is kind of held online, often forever, and what is our digital footprint there, and what does that mean about knowledge being static, and what does that mean about how we're thinking about knowledge when it's constantly being changed, and where are we getting this information from? I think there's a lot of wonderful questions that digitization brings up that we can be thinking about to continue troubling. What is the canon? What is knowledge? What counts? Whose voice is missing? Whose voice is silenced? But there's a lot of ways that it can be used to erase all of that. And again, it can be another form of whitewashing, frankly, or equity washing.
Good points. I think we have time for a couple more questions before we wrap up for today. And again, everyone will have a copy of the recording, so you'll get a chance. I've had a lot of people wanting me to repeat what you said, and I said, that's okay, you're going to get the recording. You'll be able to hear it all over again. So here's a question. People who are marginalized by low incomes are by and large not at the table in education, are not in leadership roles. May have been their history in the past, but by and large they're not in our schools, easily able to identify and interrupt policies that exclude low-income students. How could this be addressed?
Great question.
Either one of you can take that one.
Well, consciousness, raising consciousness building on the parts of people who are in schools. I think ultimately there's we have to recognize that people are the experts of their own experience. So how do we bring those voices into the conversation, and not just bring them in so that they're sort of sitting there observing the conversation, but make them the center of the conversation. I think a lot of schools are really worried about that because they're afraid people are going to come in and have ideas that are going to, that are going to not work with a budget or, whatever it is. So, I think at the individual local level, those kinds of conversations are a point of departure, but this is a bigger policy issue about whose interests are driving public education and how we're doing public education. And I know in the US, the answer to that is corporate interests are mostly doing that. So I think we have to take a look at the bigger thing too. But in the immediate term, I've seen schools transform their practice and their policies by, going through a process of deepening, what Katie and I call equity literacy, but it's really just about deepening their consciousness about how inequity and injustice operate in all different kinds of aspects of schools, and then working with people in the local community to address those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Paul, I completely agree. I think, it is a much larger issue than that we need to be addressing, like all the systemic ways in which parents are kept out of schools in the first place. And, even the notion of parents not coming into schools is problematic, right? We need to change the sort of middle class views that we have around parent engagement. We need to go where parents are and where they live and work and be in relationship with one another. And I think the importance of building relationship and building reciprocal trust, and that trust means that it's not going to be an extractive relationship. It's not going to be something, it's not going to be a relationship where we go out and we meet with families and communities as a way to say that we've, consulted, but there's no actual engagement in the decision making. This needs to be a collaboration. We need to recognize that we need to meet with parents and families on their terms at times and locations that are convenient for them, where they feel that their voice is actually being heard. Oftentimes that's off turf and not on school property. That many schools have hold a lot of trauma for families who have experienced generational marginalization by low income, by race, etc. And so thinking about how do we build these relationships of trust and reciprocity and actually demonstrate that we are going to do something with the information that we've gathered. And so it doesn't become, this is something that we're just going to kind of keep doing and keep perpetuating to create the facade of consultation, but that it's actually going to impact our policies, our practices, and our structures and their children, that it's going to have a positive benefit and for them. I think that's a really important thing that we need to be thoughtful about as we engage parents and families in this work.
Wow. Okay. I love both your answers. I think it is a question that kind of brings to light a lot of other things that we need to think about how we're doing with parents, with engagement, that kind of thing. We've had a lot of questions about systemic change. I feel like you've addressed that somewhat. The other question that keeps coming up is what do you recommend as the best professional development for young teacher candidates? What do we do with our teacher candidate programs to ensure that we're building in more equity, literacy, learning before they hit our schools? And so any final thoughts on either one of those things as we wrap up in the next 2 minutes?
Paul, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a lot of good models for professional development. But the one thing I would say is a lot of the professional development around like equity, diversity, and inclusion is pretty fluffy, and it's purposely fluffy because it's more marketable if it's fluffy. So I think the main thing is when you're looking at different models to potentially bring in, to make sure you're bringing in one that is really designed to help people learn how to first recognize inequity in all the ways that it operates, recognize inequity and oppression and all of that, and then to be able to know how to respond to it and to know how to drive it out of the school. So cultural competence doesn't do that, cultural proficiency doesn't do that. There's nothing wrong with those as being a piece of it, but those things are popular because they don't do those things. So I think it really has got to put equity and justice at the center, keep them at the center, and talk about how do we create an equitable and just learning environment? How do we drive racism? How do we drive sexism, heterosexism, transphobia? That should be the center of the conversation, and everything should feed into that purpose. I would just avoid, there are some organizations that come in and they have a 3-year process and you spend 2 years just doing personal reflection. Personal reflection is really important, but students who are experiencing oppression right now can't wait for us to go through a 2-year process of naming our own biases before we start addressing the issue. So it's got to also be this overlapping process where you're identifying stuff and working on that right now. What can I be doing? How can we address this right now? While the people who are starting at an earlier place and might need some basic personal reflection might get a bit of that. But equity and justice in the center, not celebrating diversity, not cultural competence, but equity and justice.
Okay, Vidya, you got the last 10 seconds. Go for it.
Completely agree. And I want to say, Paul, I completely agree with everything that you just said. It needs to be uncomfortable work. This needs to be work that troubles who we are and how we are and relate to one another in the world. And I also want to caution us against using this as a distraction from what's actually happening in schools as well. As somebody who teaches in initial teacher education here and has amazing colleagues who are doing really transformative, deep work around equity and justice, one of the biggest challenges we have is when students are in schools and they aren't experiencing the same kinds of conversations that we're having here. And so I want to just caution us all to not use initial teacher education as a distraction from doing the work that we need to be doing in our schools as well, although it needs to happen.
That's amazing. So we're going to wrap things up. We're actually right at the 1 o'clock mark. And thanks to all those folks who've stayed with us this whole time. I want to thank you all. You're going to receive a copy of the recording. You'll get the handouts and more reminders about the things that we talked about in the very beginning, the events with Paul in November and May, all of the great work that Reskin has done, the podcast series, all of that stuff will be shared out with you following this broadcast. I just want to say thanks to you guys. I mean, you already know this, but you're two of my favorite people in the whole world. Anytime I get a chance to work with you, I just look forward to it so immensely. Once again, thanks everybody for giving us your time, and we will continue this series and be in touch very soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.